I recognize that the start of the new year is typically a start in which we are making our way back from resolutions, declarations of recommitment. In fact, all of the culture that we live in responds to the start of a new year, initially by looking backwards and then looking forward to what it is we hope will take place in the coming year. In reading this passage, I'm seeing a similar pattern that's not only unique to the culture of our day, but the culture in which the writer of Genesis is trying to communicate a portrait of God that's helpful for us to see. You might remember that as we've walked through these chapters in previous days, something had taken place in the life of this man Jacob. And we are now in chapter 35, 30 years ahead of where he first met God in this place. It has been more than 30 years since Jacob has promised God that if he were to stay with him, if he were to deliver him, he would make his way back to Bethel and not only give him a tenth of his earnings, but he had vowed to make God his God if he would but keep him. He made that promise 30 years ago. And you'd like to think somehow that Jacob has been a portrait of integrity, of keeping his promise, but that has not been the case at all. In fact, right after Jacob finished wrestling with the angel, or what some have identified as a theanthropic being, right after Jacob's encounter with the angel, he met his brother Esau and promised Esau that I'll meet you in Seir. And instead of keeping his promise, Jacob went in the opposite direction and found himself in a place called Sukkoth. He then left Sukkoth, made his way to a place called Shechem, never keeping his commitment to do what he told Esau he would do, and never keeping his commitment to do what he promised God he would do. More than 30 years later, God now speaks to Jacob again and has to remind him of a conversation they had 30 years ago. In fact, the root of Jacob is significant because not only does he go directly to Seir, he stops in a place called Sukkoth, then makes his way to a place called Shechem. And in Shechem, his daughter is raped. In Shechem, his sons murder the innocent. In Shechem, the fear of being hunted now is upon Jacob, because more than 30 years later, rather than keep his promise to God, now God has to speak to him and tell him to go back to where you began. I'm amazed at sometimes how gracious God is. And I am aware of the need for renewal because sometimes we live in an environment where our attitudes and our commitments are so broken down that God has to remind us again what we said. I realize that something has happened, and sometimes tragic and painful events are the thing that remind you of what it is you told God you would do. And God has to bring you back to a place of renewal. And one of the reasons why the need for renewal exists in all of our lives is because the human mind, our memories are faulty. You see, you get up every morning and take for granted the beating of your heart, the facility of speech, the activity of your limbs, the regulated right mind. But it's not like that for everybody. Somebody laid down last night, a genius, woke up this morning an imbecile. Somebody laid down last night the picture of health, and this morning couldn't move from their own bed because of paralysis. Somebody last night, with the blood moving throughout their body, experienced a clot, and because of today, they couldn't wash their face. They couldn't comb their hair. And the reason why we need to be renewed is because we forget. We forget the simplest of things. And sometimes what happens to human memory is it forgets what God has done, and sometimes what God has promised. But sometimes God has to remind us, you need to do what you promised me you'd do. I don't think it's unfair to recognize in a crowd this size, God took us out of some things, and we promised God, if you ever get me out of this, I'll do such and such and such a thing. Come on, don't kid me. Is there anybody here who can remember going through a really tough time and saying, God, if you get me out of this? And you meant it when you said it, but you have forgotten. And over time, life has worn down your commitment, worn down the promise you made. And every now and then, God has to realign you and remind you not only of what he promised, but what you promised. And Jacob is in a place where God is reminding him something that he has said. You see, the thing I'm understanding about God is that when God has made a commitment to himself regarding you and I, you should know that God has a promise that he's made. But you can't spend all of your energy and focus on what God has promised you, because if you do, you'll lose sight of the fact that God still has a purpose for you. And even though the promise may have been fulfilled, it's not over yet. Because God is not done with the fulfillment of a promise, because he's still working out his purpose. Which is why when he takes Israel into the promised land, somebody closes the book and says, we're done. He fulfilled his promise. And God says, no, not yet. My purpose is not complete, and you still have to fight in the promised land. Because the fulfillment of promise is not the end of purpose. Which is why even though God has done some things, the reason you still have tension and difficulty is because his purpose is that you're going to look like Jesus. And he has to send things into your life to keep conforming you into his image. And so the celebration of a promise fulfilled is one thing, but the fulfillment of God's purpose is another. And what I've discovered about God is that God will allow you to do your own thing, but his purpose is going to be realized in your life. Jacob has been in and out, up and down, involved in stuff he has had absolutely no business. And yet God has made a commitment that I'm still not done, because my purpose has not yet been realized in your life. Tell you what, I'm glad about that, because I think most of us in the room have been so trifling, so tricked up, so messed up, that if it were humanly possible, we would have destroyed ourselves. But God said, my purpose is not yet complete. You tried to kill yourself with alcohol, drugs, promiscuous living, taking chances, and violence. And yet God in his grace brought you still here on the first Sunday in the new year. Now that's worthy of celebration. Now somebody ought to believe that, you know what, in spite of who I am and have been, you have still been good to me. So renewal, the need for renewal is because, humanly speaking, we have these faulty memories. So God has to renew him to the place where the commitment was made. I talked to a pastor who was describing to me a couple who got married. And you know, when you get married, you make all these vows. In fact, one of the things you do at the altar is you make a vow. And here's what you say, y'all, for when you get married. Single people, when you get married, this is what you typically say. For sickness and in health, for richer, for poor, for better, for worse, till death do we part. Now, I don't think there's anything that happens in a marriage that's not covered in that. When y'all get quiet, I know. Sickness and in health, richer for poor, better for worse, till death do us part. What's not covered in that? And he was describing to me a couple who had spent 3 hours in his office trying to explain to him why they need to divorce. And he said he got frustrated trying to talk to them until he just ended the conversation. He said as he was packing up in his office, he goes out into the sanctuary, and that couple is sitting in the sanctuary. And he said they were involved in this deep conversation. He later found out that while sitting in the sanctuary, they had returned to the place where they had made those vows. And they were rehearsing in their conversation the declaration they had made in that place. And by returning to that place, it became enough to provoke them to rethink what they had promised God. Not what they had said to each other, but what they had promised God. And sometimes what you have to do is go back to a place where certain declarations were made, where certain promises, vows were initiated, and you return to the place of your commitment in order to renew your commitment. Am I making sense to you? It's why God has them back at Bethel. Why? Because it's too easy to forget what you promised. And sometimes you have to go back to that place. God has to drive you there again where you can remember the commitments you've made, because humanly speaking, our memories are faulty. And I've seen it, because sometimes the commitment you made when you were sick the first time, you remember when you get sick the second time. The commitment you made when you were broke the first time is the commitment that you remake when your money gets funny the second time. And you remember why God has to bring you back to the same place. I'm glad that he does. I'm glad that he doesn't destroy us. I'm glad that God in this text says to Jacob, I'm bringing you back here. And as a result of that, after settling here, building an altar, Jacob remembers some other things. Because in the need for renewal, there's a need to recognize the human fortunes will also change. There's a need to recognize not only the faulty human memory, but the recognition that life is fleeting and that somehow or another my fortunes can change. It's why I gave you that long runway. Because in 2018, you don't know what you'll meet. The text says that they began to divest themselves of idols and allegiances. I'll save the deeper explanation for that when we meet on Thursdays. But they now must get rid of that which would get in the way of their allegiance to God. And I submit to you that you really can't go forward in renewal until you bury some stuff that you are more in love with than Him. I'd also argue that burying is not enough, because when you bury stuff, you can go back and dig it up. That the movement of renewal requires more than just burying. At some point, you've got to destroy the idols that you tend to. That your commitment to whatever it is you love, other than Him, can not only just be buried, it has to be destroyed. Because the only way you can move forward is if you are willing to let some stuff go. And so He says to them, whatever it is you've got in place of God, get rid of it. And the text says they bury it. And the text says that because of that, God now gives them a measure of security. Well, you say, why do they need to be secure? Well, because first of all, you just murdered an entire village in Shechem. And the husbands and the wives and the parents and a host of other people are still looking for you, Jacob, and your sons. And if you believe that going forward is going to be based upon your own ability to secure your own safety, I have news for you. You need a God. And in fact, with what's taking place in our world today, the only safe place is if you've got a God on your side. And the Bible says that God became the security for them as they move forward, even in this place called Bethel. But I want to offer this caveat as well. Because inside this text, the Bible says in verse 8, soon after this, Rebekah's old nurse, Deborah, died. She was buried beneath the oak tree in the valley below Bethel. And ever since, the tree has been called Allon Bakuth, which means oak of weeping. Now that Jacob had returned from Paddan Aram, God appeared to him again at Bethel. And God blessed him, saying, your name is Jacob, but you will not be called Jacob any longer. From now on, your name will be Israel. So God renamed him Israel. And then God said, I am El Shaddai, God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. So the new start is a matter of renewal that requires putting something off. Because renewal requires that you let go of some things, because those things can find seepage back into your allegiance. And the need for renewal demands the putting off of some things. But it's not only a new start. Renewal is required because there will always be new sorrows, new things that hurt. Now there is the death of an old faithful woman, a woman who's been a part of the family clan for decades. She dies. And if you continue in this text, here in verse 16, you can read it later tonight, there'll be another death, the death of somebody he loves named Rachel. And if you tease the chapter further out to verse 29, he's going to experience the death of his father, who breathes his last and goes to be buried with the ancestors. And in this new place of renewal, there is the death of two women, the death of his father. And while this is a new start, It is a new start, but it is filled with new sorrows. You say, why do I need a God on my side? Because in 2018, you have no idea what you will have to confront. And I'm submitting to you that rather than getting into 2018 and then going, oops, God, what are you doing? It might make sense to begin now the discipline, the regimen of spending time with the one who can secure and stabilize so that when the worst day of your life comes, you are not trying to call down all of heaven then. You simply do what you've always done. On the night that he's betrayed, he's found in the Garden of Gethsemane. You say, why is that significant, Reverend? Because that's where he's been going his entire earthly ministry. He doesn't just go to Gethsemane on the night he's being betrayed. He's been going to Gethsemane and praying and talking and ministering and listening with his Father his entire 3.5-year ministry. And so when the worst befalls him, when Judas betrays him, he doesn't go get a drink. He doesn't go get a snort. He doesn't go get a hit. He doesn't go get blazed. He doesn't call up somebody. He goes back to doing what he's always done. And if you will make a habit of meeting God, not just in emergency situations, but if you will make a habit of getting up in the morning and spending time with God, going to bed at night, spending time with God, when whatever is waiting for you hits you, you will simply find another strength, another gear to keep right on moving and not disintegrate. He has to experience now in this renewed place the same old issues of death and dying and sorrow. And somebody says, well, you know, I need you to know that God's power in the new year is going to bless, 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 bless. That's heretical teaching. That's damnable teaching. It is not biblical teaching, and God has not promised any of us a rose garden existence. I want to be blessed like everybody else. But what I'm clear about is that God is sovereign. And one of the reasons why you got to be careful how you identify blessings is because blessings isn't always bad stuff that happens to you. It isn't always good stuff that happens to you. Sometimes it's a combination of both. Because sometimes when you look at the hardest seasons of your life, the hardest seasons of your life have been the times when you grew the most. Come on, do I have a witness? When you felt isolated and alone and there was nobody else, God swooped down and lifted you up. When you had given up to die because you thought the prognosis was so bad, God came in and rescued and restored, and in some cases he healed. And when you thought you were going to lose your natural mind, he made real the promise, I will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on me because he trusts in me. And God brought you through one season after another, after another, after another. And when you look back on how bad it was, you can't help but say, God, thank you, because in that season, I got stronger. In that season, I became more intimate with you. In that season, I saw who I was and I saw who you were. And I'm so glad you took me through that difficult place because now I'm better. Thank you for the blessing of my negatives that you turned into positives. I still want to honor you because you're good. Anybody here know what I'm talking about? Anybody here remember seeing God do the impossible when you close your eyes, waiting for the bottom to come up, and he rescued you anyhow? And what the devil meant for evil, God meant for good. And here you sit on a Sunday morning, on the first Sunday of the new year, with your hands raised, your mouth open, saying, God, thank you for bringing me through. Therein lies the need for renewal. Because sometimes there are new sorrows. There are new starts, yes, but there are new sorrows. And in the midst of that, God reminds us who he is. The last point is because even in the midst of these brand new starts, in the midst of these new and sometimes difficult sorrows, there is always this new joy. In the text, God reminds him not only of who he is, he renames him. He had changed his name after the wrestling with the angel. But you see, sometimes you forget these encounters. You forget what God has done. I'm not mad at us, humanly speaking. I'm advocating this morning that you try not to forget, that you work hard to remember. But what I realize is we all do it. Please don't look at me like I got some S on my chest. When I go through difficult times, every now and then God has to remind me, wait a minute, Negro. I'm the same God that brought you from here, brought you to here. Why doubt me now? And I don't care how holy the person you're talking it to tries to seem. Everybody has moments when they have faith and doubt mingled together, where you look around and you can't see all that God has done. And I don't care how spiritual they are. I don't care if it's Bishop Lightbulb from Mississippi. I'm telling you that everybody, humanly speaking, will forget from time to time just how faithful God has been. And so you need a daily reminder where you meet God and he can tell you, I'm El Shaddai. I am God Almighty. I don't care where you are, what you've been through. I run this. And I can turn it around. I can transform the situation, or I can transform you, or I can do both. But I am God. And you need a reminder this year that the same God in 17 is the same God in 18. Yeah. He reminds him exactly who he is. And I want you to leave this place today more committed to the recognition that this daily reminder from the Lord and this daily commitment to devotion is something you need to embrace going into the new year. I raise that because, like Jacob, all of us can get caught up in the grind and the ebb and flow, and life can wear you down to such a degree you forget. And so the need for places of renewal and revival for you and I are a part of our existence going forward. Don't you get so preoccupied in your job, your school, making money, living your life, that you forget where you need to spend your time. Don't you get that busy. Everybody suddenly becomes very, very spiritual in the midst of difficulty. But see, you can't forget about God 364 days out of the year and then suddenly try to make up for it in one day. You need to find a daily ritual of handling everything that's coming at you by spending time in the text and time in his presence. And I'm done. Because if you leave out of here going into this new year with the same practices as last year, you're going to keep coming back to this place. The thing I'm glad is that God is not vindictive or mean-spirited. You see, I read chapter 35, and I don't see all of Jacob's imperfections. I see of how great God is, because I would have cut Jacob off a long time ago. I brought you through every encounter. I met you and wrestled with you. I changed your name then. And in chapter 28, a promise was made. You, Jacob, promised me that if I would be with you, you would come back to the place. You would not only give me a tithe of what you possessed, but that you would serve me. And you have kept none of what you promised. If I were God, that'd be it. If I were God, that'd be the last promise I'd take from your lips. And it's easy for you to read the story of Jacob and assume that that's Jacob's problem. Because when you're self-righteous, you can't see that Jacob is you. But God is so incredibly good that even to Jacob, he comes back. He says, let me show you who I am. I keep my word. And I made a commitment to keep you. And as foolish as you are, even you can't undo what I promised myself. That's a God worth celebrating. That's a God worth rejoicing. And that's a God worthy of your allegiance, worthy of you spending time to know him intimately and allow him to show you who you are not, as he renews you, restores you, and moves you forward to whatever 2018 holds for you. And the need of that is for every one of us in this place.